1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchase Skinwalker Ranch. Terry looks out at one of these tree lines and he notices this huge wolf. The wolf comes over to this calf and immediately has the whole head of the calf in its jaws, just trying to rip it out of the cage. Terry starts firing shots at the wolf. The wolf is just totally unaffected. They decide to go track this wolf, and Terry could easily make out these footprints, but just suddenly stopped. There's no blood trail. There's nothing. It just walked in and vanished. And one night he catches out of his periphery what looks like a kind of mass of something moving around in the trees near his property. He would describe the mass as looking almost like a stealth fighter jet, but really small, and he makes the tiniest of noises against the brush. The lights immediately turn off and it angles itself so it's facing directly at Terry. And he's staring at it and it just flies away. By the spring of 1995, things have gotten really, really bad. One night he's sitting on his porch with his rifle. He notices out on the horizon orangey orb. He describes it as a portal. In the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world. He can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs. So a blue orb started showing up on their property, and his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking, and so he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest, and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. Billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in National Institute for Discovery Science, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. So he purchases the ranch, and so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and these 2 researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape, and you can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening. They see this black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them. And they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up, and it goes right past them. About 30 feet away from them, they're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team, and to this day they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. Some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows. They notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. The campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed. And so later that day, some Madera County sheriffs made their way out to Johnson Meadows. They would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. When Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious. She would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched to look for Sandra. No one had seen Sandra, and despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. But then, 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself. She had no gear with her. She was barefoot. She had a black shirt on. She had blue jeans on. She had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. She didn't wave them down. She didn't act distressed. She didn't look like she needed any help. They just kind of saw this person minding their own business, and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, Sandra's vehicle was located, and the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine. Authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. Someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor. The Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked. They thought, maybe Sandra got hurt and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was. Authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number. If you see this, your family really misses you. The search for Sandra would continue over the next several days. Nothing new was discovered, but there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children decide, let's just pull over and we'll have a quick lunch. They hear their 3-year-old son, named Caden, start talking. He was turned and looking out his open window into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation. And so Victoria looks at her son and goes, "Who are you talking to?" And he would say, "There's a woman out there and she needs our help." They turn back to Caden and they say, "Honey, we don't see anyone out there." And he says, "Mom, she's lying face down and she's dead. She had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair." When the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women. And Caden looks at these pictures and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs would return to that section of Shut-Eye Peak, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her. A 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero decided to go for a walk up in the mountains, and he wanted to go explore the different caves. There was light coming out of one of the cave entrances, and he's starting to hear sounds. He realizes it's definitely a person, and they're definitely screaming. There also sounds to be a large contingent of other people, and he peeks his head right around the edge of the opening, and he looks inside, and what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror. He would run nearly 10 miles to the nearest police station. The way he described it to police was he basically thought he saw vampires. One of the police officers, his name was Luis Martinez, he would say, "Okay, kid, bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around." Later on in the day, the other police officers, they realized that Luis and the boy had not returned yet. The police and the Mexican army, they head out to where this cave was. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. 2 brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, they decided they were going to pull off their biggest heist yet. They were going to rip off an entire town. They would convince the villagers that they, the brothers, were actually prophets of an exiled Incan god. And if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. And so almost immediately, the villagers effectively became the Hernandez brothers' slaves. But after a couple of months of this, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with the Hernandez brothers. And so the brothers recruit this young woman named Magdalena Solis, and they tell her, "Hey, we need you, if you're willing, to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess. And so when you show up, they'll know that we were serious." The plan worked exactly as the brothers wanted it to. However, there was an element of their plan they could not possibly have accounted for. And that was what Magdalena did next. Even though Magdalena was fully aware that what she was getting herself into was an act, it had this profound impact on her. She literally believed she was a reincarnated Incan goddess, and she was not a merciful one. She also was becoming completely delusional. She convinced herself that in order to survive, she needed to start drinking blood. And so for the next several weeks, Magdalena would order everyone in the village to go up to the cave for a blood ritual. She identifies her next sacrifice, and out of fear, the other villagers would launch themselves on top of the chosen sacrifice. She would have the sacrifice strung up to one of the pikes while they were still alive, and then she would carve their heart out while they were alive, and then she would drink their blood. And Sebastian, the 14-year-old boy, poked his head around and looked into that cave. He watched one of these sacrifices having their heart cut out. He and the police officer, Luis Martinez, they would go back to the cave, and Magdalena and her cult would spot them, capture them, and drag them both into the cave, and both of them would be ritualistically sacrificed. When the police and army arrived, all of the villagers had been ordered up to the cave where they had barricaded themselves inside with weapons. There's this big shootout with all of the villagers, and during the shootout, the majority of the villagers are killed. The Hernandez brothers, they're also killed in the shootout. Magdalena and her brother Eliezer, they were still alive. They were trying to hide from the authorities, and so they would be arrested. Amazingly, none of the villagers ever testified against Magdalena or her brother. Clearly, they were more terrified of the Incan goddess than they were terrified of the prospect of 30 years in prison. And all those people that knew Bibo the best were asked, why do you think he did what he did? None of them have an answer. Bibo got a job at the SeaTac airport as a ground service agent for Horizons Airline. It was not a job he necessarily wanted, but they needed the cash. They asked him to be on a two-person tow team. On that fateful day, a passenger airplane owned by Horizon Airlines flew into SeaTac airport where Bibo worked. Bibo arrived and he climbed inside the empty aircraft and made his way into the cockpit. He followed the startup procedure until the plane was on and the propellers were starting to turn. Air traffic control bombarded Bibo over the radio, asking him, "What are you doing? This is unauthorized movement. You should not be heading towards the runway right now." But Bibo never responded. Instead, he just continued on until he reached the beginning of the runway, at which point, despite having no flight experience, minus some video games, he managed to go full throttle and get this plane careening down the runway and successfully took off. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. Over the course of his 1 hour-long flight, he expertly performed backflips and barrel rolls and these huge loops in the sky, dangerous maneuvers that even expert pilots might risk stalling the plane and crashing. But he didn't. It was like he'd been doing this his whole life. The extremely professional, very calm air traffic controller tries to convince Bibo that he really needs to come down and land this aircraft. But Bibo kind of laughs it off and says, "You know, I wasn't really ever trying to land this plane." And then in Bibo's most poignant moment, he tells the controller that he's just a broken guy and he's got a couple of screws loose and he didn't know it until now. At 8:45 p.m., the nose of the plane was seen pointed straight down at the earth. 1 minute later, at 8:46 p.m., Bibo intentionally crashed into a small island off the coast of Seattle. He was the only fatality in the crash. The internet gave Bibo a new nickname to commemorate the fact that basically no one could have done this but him. And so they named him the Sky King.